Yeah, do you hear me? I'm eating my baklavas, mini baklavas from Al Shark in the neighborhood.
Sorry, how many pages do you have in your head? It's 4 pages and 6 pages. Just your notebook, right?
Excuse me?
It's just your notebook, right?
Yes. Good afternoon to everyone, and a warm welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, to the library of the Institute, for those of you here who are here with us physically, and to all those who are with us virtually. This is the last in a series of 4 weeks of presentations of this year's Europe's Futures Fellowship Group. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm the acting rector of the Institute, and I head the Europe's Futures Ideas for Action program and project. It gives me great pleasure to present our 2 speakers of a group of 8 fellows this year. To my left is Valbona Zeneli, who will speak first and who I will present in a short moment. And the second speaker is Professor Soli Özel, who is to my far left, and who will speak after Valbona and after the comments and questions that we will have. Valbona Zeneli is the chair of the Strategic Initiatives Department at the George Marshall Center in Germany, in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. She has been there for nearly 10 years. More than 10 years. And prior to that, she actually hails originally from Albania. She was a professor at the European University in Tirana. She teaches and specializes in international relations, in security and foreign policy issues, and writes profusely on these issues related not only to the region of Southeastern Europe, but to other issues, and of course is engaged in many other activities. Today, she will be talking about the influence of China in Southeastern Europe and the way that influence affects the EU accession process of the countries of the Western Balkans to the European Union. So once again, welcome. Valbona, very happy to have you with us as a Europe's Futures Fellow.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Well, thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction, and I'm very glad, I'm delighted to be here at IWM. So I thank you all. Thank you. I thank the ERSTE Foundation also. It's a great pleasure to be here around this cohort of fellows that are focusing on such important, interesting topics that are very important for the European future. Before I get started, also I'd like to point out that this, whatever I'll say here, represent my own views, not the institution where I work or the other affiliated institutions. So as Ivan mentioned in his introduction, my focus will be in looking at what is the Chinese engagement in Southeastern Europe, more particularly in the Western Balkans, in the Balkan area. And how is that changing over time? How has that increased over the last, let's say, over the last decade? But also, most importantly, the question will be how that will affect not only security in the region, but the Euro-Atlantic integration process of these countries, and furthermore, the European security and transatlantic relations. So many research questions there. We'll see how this will play out. But when we look at the region, I think that when we look at Chinese engagement there, it's in line with Beijing's economic and geopolitical agenda in Europe. So it should not be seen separated. And so over the last 10, 15 years, not only the Balkans, Southeastern Europe, but Central and Eastern Europe has received an unprecedented level of tension when it comes to Chinese engagement in the region. And it started back in 2012 with the 16+1. That was a platform, a regional platform, very similar to other platforms that China, Beijing has used in other areas in Africa, Latin America. So there was nothing new there. But the objective was to further cooperation, economic cooperation with those countries. What's important that sometimes we miss it, I think that was the very first important signal of Chinese engagement in Europe. Belt and Road Initiative came after that, a year after, in 2013, and this regional platform was included, became an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So the entire region is critical to Beijing's objectives, aims in Europe for that we've seen with strategic undertaking, mainly technological in core European Union countries, Western countries, and infrastructure development, let's say, in the European periphery. And we're seeing that a lot in Central Eastern Europe, but also in the Balkans. In my opinion, the Chinese investors do not see Europe as a whole, of course, it sees it in three distinct zones, three distinct areas: West, South, and East. And that is based on economic wealth of countries, technological advancement in each of the countries, geographical location, but also institutional framework. And that is the last point. Both we know that the Balkans is very important geographically for Chinese interest in Europe writ large, but that part of the institutional framework, this is what I want to focus in my research, look at what are some of the distinctions when it comes to Chinese engagement in the Balkans compared to the other countries of the 16+1. It became 17+1 platform and now is back to 16+1. So some of the reasons why Beijing and Chinese investors are interested in the region is for, as I mentioned, strategic position, market opportunities, looking for foreign direct investment that are focusing on markets. It's a huge market of 120 million consumers that it's increasing. We have growing, income per capita in this country, so it's an important market. Demand for preferential lending from China is very high in all these countries. Human capital is cost effective compared to other areas. And that's why I think we will see more in the future Chinese investment that are driven on efficiency more than just on market. And of course, political concessions in many countries when it comes to Beijing are very high. And those are some of the main factors why we see this increased influence there. However, we call it as a group a regional platform, but there are many differences inside the platform itself. And although it's supposed to be a multilateral platform for economic cooperation, at the end of the day, we see a lot of bilateral relations between Beijing and specific countries that are strategic partners of China inside this platform. And I can mention in Eastern Europe, we have Hungary, which is the strategic partner. And then in the Balkans, we have Serbia, the strategic partner of China in the region. So all these countries are different, have different institutional frameworks, different levels of economic development, different levels of industrial development. From the very start, we need to understand that, although this has existed for so many years, what we have seen on the ground in terms of economic engagement, it lags far behind the initial promises. I mean, it was just last year they reached in terms of trade between the 16 countries, but 17 because Greece was included, and that's a very important chunk when it comes to that trade and investment relations. Was reached the 100 billion, which makes it almost 17% of the trade that China has with the European Union as a whole. When it comes to investment, it's much lower. It's less than 10% of the total investment that China has in the European Union countries or the whole continent of Europe. And it's very important to see that almost 75% of all Chinese foreign direct investment that have arrived in Europe over the last decade are focused on four main countries that attract 75% of all that. And those are Italy, Germany, Italy, Holland, and the UK. And those are technological driven investment. Now, when it comes to the Balkans, because this is also part of my research, we all know that the Balkans lags far behind the European Union when it comes to infrastructure and economic development. It's important to say that these countries are in desperate needs of investment. The entire region of the Western Balkans I think attracts less than 1% of the total foreign direct investment, the global foreign direct investment. Actually, it's 0.6% to be more precise. So there is need for investment, there is need for lending and for infrastructure development. And then there is a huge gap between level of incomes of the population there with the European Union. So the incomes in the region are only 14% of the level of income with the European Union countries. So that shows the level of economic development in the region. So the huge infrastructure deficits in the Balkans combined with the lack of capital, loose regulation practices, lax public procurement rules and poor labor regulations actually appeal to Chinese investors looking to easily establish bases and invest, I'll say, invaluable assets in the region. And capital rich and ready to outspend many Western actors in the region, in the Balkans, which actually are deterred a lot of times from the questionable business practices or the not favorable business climate in the region, then it's so much easier for the Chinese, mainly state-owned companies, to maintain a visible advantage compared to the Western companies in the Balkans. So, of course, Beijing wants to use the Balkans as an entry point into the European market. But also one of the concerns is that although Chinese officials are in favor of the EU integration process of the region of the Balkans, because they need stability and security, and also that's the best way into really investing, but also not only economic, but also political capital in countries that in the future will be EU members. The questions that rise have to do with the questionable business practices, with standards, with labor, environmental standards, but also standards of good governance. And that whole thing will make then the process of EU integration, a process of the region, will make it much more difficult. But it's also the appeal. So we're seeing in the region that perception in the Balkans is shifting to being quite positive, very positive when it comes to China. We saw that also during the pandemic with the massive, campaigns of information or disinformation regarding mass diplomacy, and then later on vaccine diplomacy in the region. So we're seeing very positive feedback when it comes to this win-win narrative of economic development that China could bring to the Balkans. And on the other side, we have discussed also in previous meetings here the enlargement fatigue or the reform fatigue too that we have seen in the countries in the Balkans. That's playing also a role into people then having to question the future of the Euro-Atlantic process in the region. And we're seeing that slowly. So that is also one of the questions that I want to pose in my research, to see, what are the differences, what are the similarities that we see in Chinese investment, not only economic, but also cultural, academic. We have the opening of many Confucius institutes in the region, but not only that, cultural events that are playing a very important role, even where real economic relations are missing. We're seeing much more of this academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, and a higher, political and diplomatic influence in this country. So understanding the differences, understanding similarities, but also, an important research question that I think will be important to understand, not only for the Balkans, not only in the case of the Balkans, but also more broadly, is that, what are the specific economic and political conditions in each country that make it attractive for Chinese investments? And how has the Chinese, political also engagement, diplomatic engagement in this region changed and has played out over time. Is there any connection between perception on the accession process and an increased, economic influence of China in these countries? I mentioned the academic engagement and collaboration with universities. What is the strategic message? Do we see similarities in the Balkans and broader in 16+1 platform with the other EU member states? So these are some of the research questions that I would like to explore more. In terms of facts and what we are seeing nowadays in the Balkans, we still see that although trade levels have increased and China has become the second largest trading partner for many Balkan countries, still trade levels remain low. It's almost $5 billion, and that's only 4% of the 16+1 total trade level. So you understand how not important economic piece the Balkans plays in the 16+1. Serbia, even there, is the main trading partner with almost half of the trade. But also an important element is to look at, trade exchanges. We see that trade is very heavily tilted in favor of China for more than 70 or 80% of that, which means it's mainly Chinese imports in the region rather than vice versa. The other important elements is investment. So we're seeing an increased engagement in terms of investment, but this is mainly concessions for infrastructure development in the region. And what we hear a lot is this narrative that it's a win-win situation, and there are no strings attached to the money that's being given for infrastructure development. So in terms of total foreign direct investment, according to the American Enterprise Institute data, and even there it's difficult to understand, what is the real correct data, because there's no transparency. Even in cases where you have agreements and contracts, you cannot really understand what is the entire, amount of money. So if we take it as a whole, it will make up to 20% of the total foreign direct investment that's going in the region is Chinese money. But it is mainly 80% of that. It's lending, it's loans, it's not foreign direct investment. And unfortunately, we do not see that distinction when it's explained in terms of the increased role of China in the region. And it goes mainly transportation investment for transportation development, transport development, and also energy. Now we're seeing that especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We saw that in Serbia. Even in this case, Serbia is the biggest attractor of Chinese money, which is not foreign direct investment, but it's mainly loans that has to be paid back. We have seen more recently cases such as Montenegro. Montenegro with the highway, 40% of the Montenegrin debt goes to China. I mean, it's owned by China, and that's the Bolivar Highway. And which is built by China Road and Bridge Corporation. So bringing more than 85% the sovereign debt of the country, and then 40% goes to China. Other countries in the region, North Macedonia second with 20% of the debt going to China, and then followed by Bosnia and Herzegovina 14%, and then Serbia 12%. And all this idea of the no strings mantra is not true, actually, because there are conditions. While the money coming from the European Union, IMF, the World Bank, other institutions has strong conditionality on good governance, on transparency, on fight against corruption. On the other side, the strings that we see attached to the Chinese loans are that those projects are implemented from Chinese state-owned enterprises. Even the raw materials will come from China, actually exporting access, capacities that we haven't seen in China in terms of steel, cement, and other industrial capacities. And then, we see that also in most cases, and that's the difference between the Balkans and the other EU countries. We see also Chinese labor force in these countries. So as you see, there are a lot of questions that need to be explored, and really understanding, kind of trying to map out and understand similarities, differences, But how this will play out in the future for the Balkans as very important for the security of the European Union. I would say that I've been following this from the very beginning. The European Union did not pay attention at the very beginning at the 16+1 initiative. Actually, it saw it in a very optimistic way, such as the Belt and Road Initiative too. And then later on, concerns about security, concerns about technology, concerns about business arrangements came into play. So I think from this perspective, the Balkans could really become an area where great power competition could be a battle of great power competition if the West does not pay more attention to supporting these countries also in their economic development and democratic developments in the country. And I'll stop here. I think I'm over 20 minutes.
No, you've
good.
done fine. Thank you very much.
But we can. I'm open for questions, and we can get more into details.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you for contextualizing the Chinese operations in Europe, because, as you rightly said, this is a small part compared to big countries like Germany, Italy, and obviously where. Greece, where China has bought the biggest port of Piraeus as an entry point for seafaring trade. One thing that I'd like to just mention is that for those who are not aware of exactly what is happening, and you outlined a lot of it, is that still for the Western Balkans, about 65% of all trade is with the European Union. So, when you put the Chinese numbers there, they're still very small compared to what's happening in terms of relations, economic relations with the European Union, which doesn't diminish both the threat and the influence that the Chinese are trying to get. And maybe just the second thing is that given the Chinese investments, and I'm speaking mostly about my country, Serbia, there have been significant environmental protests about the environmental standards of a big tire factory that's being built near Belgrade, and of course about the copper smelting plant, the huge one in Bor. So, and there has been pushback so that the Serbian government even had to stop operation in part of the copper smelting plant because of but those are just some issues. But as you know, our formula is that the co-presenter, fellow and colleague has the right to ask the first question. Or give a comment.
I have a number of small questions. One, why should the Balkans be an area of great power competition? And what by great power, who do you mean? Is it economic, strategic? Is there an American presence? Will there be a Russian presence? Since the Europeans do not appear there they appear there economically, but not otherwise. Secondly, do you suspect that this interest or this flow is going to continue? And also, why do the Chinese need to be investing productively in the Balkans? It's not as if they don't have access to the European markets. And to the best of my knowledge, those who are not members do not have customs union agreements like Turkey does, which I suppose is what would make Turkey attractive for the Chinese, not to mention Turkey is actually pretty vast domestic market. Finally, as in Montenegro, there's been lately, especially in Africa where the Chinese first showed up, really immense resentment of the way the Chinese are present, as in Serbia, I suppose. Is this something that you suspect might also happen in these, not just in the Balkans, but in your platform countries?
Well, thank you, Soli. Great question. Let me start from the last one. You pointed out Turkey. I remember when I started, that was almost 20 years ago, when I started looking at mainly at, foreign direct, 15 years ago, foreign direct investment and investment, Western investment in China and all that. It was interesting to see that Turkey was the very first country that started seeing the presence of Chinese investments before we had seen that in Europe. So mainly it was trade between China and Europe. We saw the first signs of Chinese investments in Turkey many years ago.
Free custom zones.
And that's related to, you know, the point why I think, you know, why the Balkans, it's so important for the Chinese objectives, which are economic and geopolitical in Europe. And it has to do with the strategic position. The Balkans are part of the maritime Silk Road. So the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative has two roads, you know, and one of them that starts in Europe with the port of Piraeus that has become now the most important port when it comes to Chinese imports in Europe. And that's why the Balkans is so important to continue that maritime Silk Road. That is the first thing. The second, and you mentioned the free trade agreements, although we know that, you know, there's low productivity when it comes to, you know, development and production in the Balkans, I think many, you know, Chinese companies, and we might see that more in the future, will be prepared to sacrifice short-term profits to set foot on an area that it's, you know, is strategically very important from its position. But also what we might see, and I think it's starting in Serbia, we might see some investment that will be focused on trade substitution investment. And so produce, you know, in the countries of the region, and then use the free trade agreements that these countries have with the European Union to circumvent, you know, trade restrictions that China has with the European Union. And so I believe, this is my opinion, that will continue to see more of that in the future, rather than, you know, infrastructure development that might be too, you know, important also for the other place, and it might raise some eyebrows in you know, in other European capitals. Great power competition, yes, because we're seeing both Russia and China in the region. We have seen Russia, and that, you know, has been trying to, you know, to disrupt the Euro-Atlantic integration process of many countries. We've seen that in North Macedonia, we've seen that in Montenegro, and it's very clear on that. But China is more when it comes to the economic, you know, influence in the region.
Yeah, but shouldn't the Chinese be actually countering the Russians? Because based on your presentation and the logic that you just presented, it would serve China's interest for all those countries to actually become members of the European Union.
You know, yes and no,
okay.
Because I think that, you know, China and Russia in the region, I think they are strange, you know, bedfellows, as you mentioned, but I think they are aligned on some interest. And so we see that, for example, in the case of Kosovo. So, you know, Kosovo is not part of the 16+1 initiative because it's not recognized from China. And what's interesting is that even in terms of strategic partnership, you know, there's, and Ivan can talk more about that, I'm pretty sure, is that the institute that's responsible for the strategic partnership for China, it includes also Russia. So they are both under one umbrella when it comes to and then the other question I think was regarding the perception. You know, I think in terms of perception, I think this there's not so much information about you know, Chinese engagement in the region. It's going very, you know, very under the radar.
Yeah.
It's very subtle. And I think the geographical distance and plays an enormous role, not knowing, you know, what happens in China, what are the main interests in the region. So that's why I'm saying that we have this shifting of public perception that's much more positive. We've seen that in Greece, which is a member of European Union data, that a majority of population sees, you know, views China very positively. And I think we're not paying attention to all this, you know, communication strategies that Beijing has had in the region that have, you know, played that narrative of being, you know, having a very salutary relationship with the region and support in the region in the economic development, and also about this win-win cooperation, win-win relationship. I think I covered all your questions. Was there anyone missing? But, you know, we might start seeing, you know, some resentment maybe in the future, as we have seen in, Lithuania. Lithuania was the country that pulled out from the 17+1 initiative. I don't know if we'll see more countries, follow that, or we'll see countries joining. So I know that there are ideas that some of the countries of Eastern Partnership maybe, would like to become members of the, 17+1 in the future. So we might see that too, to counteract what Lithuania did. We might see new countries coming in the partnership. So, and I think Greece was included because of the port of Piraeus, that could be considered a quasi-successful project. I think the whole initiative needed some success stories to really, to continue to have, some significance. But as I mentioned in my talk, I don't think it's a real multilateral initiative. It's bilateral relations with countries, actually competitive between, the countries inside the initiative. And as some scholars or even policymakers in Europe have mentioned, I think it's seen as a way to increase influence, political and diplomatic influence, and might increase Chinese ability to divide and rule Europe. And we have already seen that with the decision-making process of the European Union in foreign and security policy, that countries that are part of the initiative have gone against the decision-making. And of course, we could not have decisions on some important issues that deal with human rights, the South China Seas, and the Belt and Road Initiative itself too.
Okay, question. Olivia.
Thank you very much, Valbona.
Present yourself.
Yes, hi, I'm Olivia Lazard, visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, and part of the Europe's Futures Fellows. So thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, there's a lot of talk about a potential model of debt diplomacy on the part of China. A lot of the discussions are essentially centering on how the debt diplomacy enables China to gain control of strategic infrastructure or strategic geographical points, such as what you were mentioning, Port Piraeus being one of them. Other people who are, who seem to be trying to bring nuance within the conversation seem to be saying, well, we should look at this quite critically, because in fact, there is no model of debt diplomacy, and it's quite risky for China to invest into countries through loans, which they know will, likely not be repaid in the future. So I'm wondering if you can comment about, is there such a thing as debt diplomacy on the part of China? What are, some of its foundations or patterns? And what are the risks if there is indeed, such a thing as debt diplomacy? The other thing is, what is there, does corruption play a role within the business model that China uses in order to gain access to certain countries through FDI or other means of financial agency? Again, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Olivia. Well, debt diplomacy, I mean, this is much bigger concept than just, focusing on the 16+1 countries or in the Balkans. And so I think we've seen that a lot in Africa. And one of the mistakes has been that we have not been studying and paying attention a lot to what happened in Africa or what happened in Latin America. And I don't know even today if there are stories, if there are studies that would look at, similarities of what's happening, with the Belt and Road Initiative, and some looking at similarities and differences of what happened in Africa many years ago. So I think, looking at the Chinese foreign investment for influence, be that, debt diplomacy or foreign direct investment that will sacrifice short-term profit for strategic undertakings, important strategic undertakings in Europe. I think we have seen that over the last 15 years, and this is kind of the second going out strategy of China. So the first one was in early 2000s when they went out mainly in Africa for natural resources markets. And I think the second going out strategy that we've seen in the last 10 years, it's really focusing on technological, raising in the technological ladder, but also having those strategic undertakings in Europe. So debt trap or debt diplomacy, we have seen in some countries that there has been backlash, but not throughout, the area where Chinese, money has gone for infrastructure development. I think it had to do also with the beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. And I think now, even in Beijing, they're looking more carefully where they're investing. It's not that type of, optimistic, throwing out money into projects that were not feasible, many of those projects. But I would like to bring the attention back to the Balkans, because that's why I mentioned the number. It's only $15 billion, all this. So it's peanuts. And that's the point. So that's why I think the Balkans is low-hanging fruit, and we're not paying much attention, because with an investment of $1 billion only, which is the one in Montenegro, you own the country. I mean, not really, because but it was just an example. So that's why it's really low level of investment, but it has very high return in these countries. And then when it comes to corruption, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that's why I want to study the institutional framework and the level of corruption, the level of good governance. And that's why it's much easier for those investments to go, and because there are non-transparent deals, non-transparent contracts, and just dealing with corrupt politicians, I think that just, helps both sides. And at the end of the day, we should really understand that, politicians think on 4-term cycles. So they want, money to flow in the country, investment that they want, and they're not caring what is the future, what is the security perspective, or it's going to be the long-term perspective on that type of investment. So I think these are some of the reasons. And why the European Union needs to do more, it's kind of, chicken and egg problem, because we know that in the region, the business environment is not attractive for foreign direct investment because of high levels of corruption, because that's singled out from foreign investors as one of the main problems for not investing in the region. But then on the other side, you increase conditionality, politicians will just, find easier and cheaper, not cheaper money, because that's also another of the narratives that has been pushed out there, that Chinese money is cheap, based on all, on data. Money coming from IMF, World Bank, and the European Union institutions is much bigger and much, as also Ivan mentioned, and cheaper, even when it comes to lending and loans, than the Chinese money. But that's part of the narrative that it's being spread up there, and we don't have much research to counter that, or a strategic communication campaign to counter that specific narrative.
Okay. My name is Zoran Nechev, also Europe's Future Fellow. I have a question a bit more pragmatic. I think that what we are seeing in the Balkans in the recent years is this kind of a, strategically, because of the kind of a return or more assertive US politics in the region, we are seeing more specific policies that are against China or China dealings in the region. But my question is very pragmatic. Most of these countries, especially when it comes to 5G infrastructure, have signed or are signatories of this MOU, which is a Clean Initiative Network of the United States. That is all good, okay. My question is, who is in the end going to pay for all of this very expensive equipment? Because we know from our past that even when you compare it to 4G infrastructure, most of the technology comes from Huawei. Huawei is the most advanced in this kind of technology, and Huawei is 3 times cheaper than any other European or US company that provides this kind of infrastructure. So, and these countries, as you have mentioned, are poor. So sometimes someone needs to pay for the difference between, you know, or let's say to look at more Western kind of companies, because for that you will get not so much advanced technology, but you have to pay also 3 times more compared to Huawei and Chinese technology. So the practical question is how we are going to go about. Someone needs to pay this difference, and these are not small amounts of money. So, okay, I understand the high politics. Okay, the orientation of all of these countries are pro-EU, you know, pro-American, but this comes with a bill, and you know, in the end, someone needs to pay the bill, and this is something that is not discussed in our country. So, what's your opinion on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Zoran. So, well, let me be clear. So, I'm not saying that, you know, we should be against Chinese investment, even, you know, in technology and things like that. We need that type of investment. I started with that, saying that the region needs foreign direct investment. It is the main driver for economic development. And the very low level has created the circumstances where we are now, that the gap with European Union countries actually is widening. It's not even, you know, becoming smaller. The point is under what circumstances and what are the absorptive capacities of the country. And when I talk about absorptive capacities, I have in mind mainly, you know, governance and standards. So these type of investments, are they going to make us be better in terms of standards and development and all that, or no? So that is the main question that, you know, we need to pose from that perspective. So it's not against. There are, as I mentioned, you know, Piraeus Port is a successful story, but you had the European standards there from the very start of the contract. Now, in many cases in the Balkans, as you know, as also in North Macedonia, that was also one of the reasons I think that the previous government, you know, was one of the, you know, corruption allegations, is that contracts, even for infrastructure projects, are not transparent. We don't know, you know, what's behind those. So I think I go back to issues of transparency and accountability and good governance. And you're right of bringing the example of 5G, because now we have kind of a political will also in many countries in the region, but broadly in Europe, to kind of looking at how they see it 5G. And I'd like to say that this has been one of the issues of not divergence, but less convergence also between the European Union and the United States when it comes to the 5G technology and the way that, you know, Chinese investments were seen there. And I mean, when it comes to Huawei, Belgrade has become, you know, technological hub of Huawei in the region. And it's part of the Chinese, you know, digital Silk Road, China's digital Silk Road. So, and, you know, in the future, it's meant to be the focal point for future Huawei initiatives. Now, do we have concerns about what we're seeing also in Belgrade in terms of, you know, the safe city surveillance, equipment, and all that? Are those issues that, you know, are concurrent with, you know, our values and human rights and things like that? I think that's the part that, you know, we need to look at the balance and see, you know, where we belong and what is our, you know, what is our future. Even when it comes to Huawei, I mean, many countries in the region are NATO countries. So is that in line, you know, so with NATO specific when it comes to technology and security too? So these are, I think, the questions that we need to look at. But I agree with your points, and that's why I was saying that we need a real strategy in the region from the European Union when it comes to economic development. EU integration process will take a long time, and we all know that. We need a real interim visionary strategy when it comes to economic development in the region, because it's not fair, as you point out, if you're not offering money for special investment and the Chinese come there and invest on that, so you cannot ask the leaders of the country to back off from that investment that's needed in the country. So that's why we have to be much more proactive when it comes to offering development money and capacities.
No, absolutely. I'd like to underscore your last point, Valbona, because in the end, it's pretty simple. If there's a vacuum, somebody will step into it, and the European Union has been complacent, basically, about the fact that all these countries want to join the European Union, and thus, they'll behave in a certain manner. The other side of the coin is, as you said several times, the urgent need for infrastructure development. For example, the Chinese built a second bridge over the Danube at Belgrade, a badly needed bridge. This was 15 years ago. I'm very happy that we have a second bridge over the Danube. Why didn't a Western company, maybe subsidized by the European Union, come in and do it? They didn't do it, and so the Chinese had space, like they're building the high-speed rail now connection, which is part of the Belt and Road from Piraeus between Belgrade and Budapest, which is slated to be finished in 3 to 4 years. Now the train takes for 400 kilometers about 7 hours. It will take about 3 hours when it's finished. So I think there has been a wake-up call in the European Union. In fact, von der Leyen is starting a 3-day trip around the Balkans, where she will in fact announce an upgrading of the speed of the train track between Belgrade and Skopje. A big investment, multi-billion. This is the first serious response to what the Chinese are doing. And so maybe that's an announcement of better things to come. And finally, on the Montenegro thing, the new Montenegrin government has gone to Brussels to try and find help for repayment of the Chinese loan on this highway, which is a very important highway because it runs again from Belgrade to the Adriatic coast at the port of Bar, which again is a potential important trade route for goods coming into Europe that probably hopefully won't be taken over by China like Piraeus.
I fully agree, Ivan, especially when it comes to the vacuum of power. That's why we saw vacuum of power in terms of the European Union integration process in the region. That's where we saw the increased influence both from China and from Russia in those years. So that's why the European Union has to be more careful and look at the region, not just technically from the perspective of the EU integration, but more geopolitically. And, as Dr. von der Leyen had mentioned, so this is going to be, it's a geopolitical commission. And I think, one of the main then priorities needs to be on the Western Balkans. And it's not, in the European backyards, as, we used to say, it's actually in the European front yard from this perspective. And that's why it has to be much more. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you. We look forward to your research and the results of the research. And I'm sure we'll have many more conversations about this because it finally links into other project that the fellows are doing. So now we move to Soli Özel, a Europe Futures Fellow who comes from Turkey. He's a professor at Kadir Has University in Istanbul, a columnist, writes and publishes books and articles. He's a voice that many listen to and invite to be heard on all related to Turkey. He was also the editor of the Turkish edition of Foreign Policy that no longer exists. Soli will be researching here what is happening in Turkey. No need to go into the details. He will talk about this to us and how that impinges on the relations with the European Union. Soli.
Thank you. My presentation will be much less precise than the previous one. I'll start with the main themes over which we discuss Turkey-European Union relations. One is geography. Does Turkey really belong to Europe? Just to remind you that the island of Cyprus is to the south of Tunisia and to the east of Ankara. Therefore, that precise geographical delineation doesn't really make sense, particularly when you think that there are those within the European Union who think that Georgia and Armenia, which happen to be way to the east of Turkey, should be members of the European Union, which will get us to another issue. That's identity. For a long time, I thought that the reason why Turkey would be a very, very hard nut to crack for the European Union wasn't necessarily the religion. It wasn't even necessarily economic underdevelopment, because plenty of studies have been presented prior to the start of negotiations that within a very short period of time, Turkish productivity levels would increase very rapidly, and Turkey would actually make up all the lost ground of the past few decades. Moreover, it was already far ahead of many of the countries that have become members in 2004. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion that it was religion, size, and maybe location multiplied by population. If Turkey's population was not 80 million, but 10 million or 12 million or maybe 20 million, it would have been an easier discussion as well. Then, of course, the issue of Turkey's current government, which after having started on a rather good track, is now the nemesis of many European political parties. I mean, Le Point putting him on the cover and basically calling him the big threat or the nemesis of Europe and stuff, language which I find a bit exaggerated, and I cannot resist the temptation. For those of you who remember, and I'm sure Ivan does, on the 16th of June 1989, the Hungarians reburied Imre Nagy. And a number of people gave sermons or eulogies at the ceremony. The last person to give a eulogy was a young, I think 22 or 26-year-old guy, and who instantaneously became the symbol, the champion of liberal democracy in Hungary. His name happened to be Viktor Orban. So when people talk about Turkey and say, well, the intentions of Erdogan, he hid them and all that, I remember this example, not that Erdogan was ever necessarily really a liberal Democrat at heart, but the thing is, these are all political entrepreneurs, and some of what we witness almost everywhere, including Turkey, is a function of the times that have changed. And the times that have changed are accentuated with one very serious, very deep, very consequential fact: the Occidentalization of the world, which perhaps an important turning point for which has arrived in 2008 with the economic crisis. Okay. So I'll come to the issue of identity. And I will read, forgive me, because otherwise I blabber and it will be a lot more than 20 minutes and he will cut me off, and I asked him to cut me off. So it may be for me, as when I look at the way I think about my topic, that it may be once more a time to discuss the future of Europe, perhaps separately from the future of the European Union, particularly if we still consider the anti-EU Britain as part of Europe. This exercise may even be useful insofar as the EU as a bureaucratic machinery, rather than a construct that emanated from the self-inflicted wounds and tragedies of the Dark Continent, can be as much a stifling force as it is the potential drafter of the roadmap for a Europe that can remain relevant in the geopolitical landscape of the world. The question imposes itself: should the EU have a geopolitical and inevitably military strategic profile? Last night, on, let's say, less comfortable circumstances, we debated this over around the table. Is the desire for strategic autonomy, which should have a much broader definition than just the military strategic one, attainable in a union which by its very nature and by the nature of the nation-state-centered world we live in, despite globalization of economies and problems, Actually, it's an amalgam of diverging interests. As we all wonder, will the economically predominant, in fact, hegemonic power of the Union, that is Germany, finally defy its own reluctance, which is due to its history, and take the strategic lead as well as the economic lead? The question attached to that, and I'm sorry I will not be here on the 30th, but it's not just whether Germany should do that, but can it do it? Meaning, did it really lose practice of leading strategically, thinking strategically, or implementing a strategy if there is one? If the European Union decides to move beyond the confines of its economic power that it is putting to good use through policies favoring the taming and hopefully the containment of tech companies, encouraging the transition to a post-fossil fuel charged economy, despite the hazards associated with that move that Olivia so scrupulously outlined last week, can it really do so without fully unifying the continent, and beyond that, without incorporating Turkey in its vision, either as a member or a special associate, a privileged partner in the parlance of a decade ago? The answer from Brussels appears to be yes, that is, the European Union can very well do without Turkey being an integral or an organic part of its working. Because recently, in a rearrangement of administrative bureaucratic structures, Turkey, which is still officially a candidate country, whose negotiations have been suspended due to its less than stellar credentials on democracy, rule of law, human rights, and the separation of powers, is put under the heading of southern neighbors and the MENA region. You will forgive me, I hope, if I find this demotion without acclamation to be a sign of the cluelessness of Brussels and a reaction to the reality of a moment rather than a reflection on a new strategic political landscape that is shaping very rapidly across the globe. This devious way of ratification of Turkey's never declared non-candidate status suggests that in the age-long debate over where to locate Turkey, define its identity, and what kind of relationship to forge with it, the exclusionary forces currently have the upper hand. As always, the mirror image of this debilitating inclination is also and forcefully present within Turkey for reasons that I will touch upon in a moment. Nevertheless, it is quite a remarkable fact that despite relentless anti-Westernism stirred up by the government, and of course, Islamists have a language that's particularly, how shall I say, illuminating on its creativity along that score. The disillusionment of even the most pro-European elites with what they perceive to be the insincerity, unhelpfulness, or the unimaginativeness of the Union, the pro-EU camp is still above 50% of public opinion today in Turkey. There is no reason to think that the current xenophobic, hysterical, and conspiracy-loaded mood in the country would not change once Turkey is run by a saner set of people who do not fear for their lives and the preservation of their privileges if they have to leave power, their material gains and undeserved statuses when they make decisions about the future of their country. Whether the major countries of the European Union can shift gears when that change occurs, assuming it will occur, and I'll make a point about that. In my judgment, whether or not they will shift gears, unfortunately, is a more dubious proposition as things stand today. There will be room for change there as well. Turkey-EU relations have been marked historically by misunderstandings, half-truths, fragile trust, and an overdose of insincerity and hypocrisy through much of their history. Today, relations have deteriorated to a historically low level. Apart from economic interests, and plenty of German companies talked about when the shortening of supply chains was the topic of the day, of looking at Turkey to substitute for their supplies in China. And much to my surprise, they even mentioned using Turkey's rather deep relations with Africa to take advantage of those relations for business purposes. the Turkish government, not Turkey itself, chose to be the dumping ground for Europe's toxic trash. And by its own volition, I must add, the entrepot of the largest refugee population in the world, that from a European perspective is a potential ticking bomb, time bomb. And apart from those issues, most channels of communication have now been closed. Transactionalism, which I consider to be the scourge of international relations, and certainly of Turkey's relations with the EU, is put its dark cloud over these relations. Developments in the world show without doubt that the security axis, whether this is of a strategic military kind or energy security or technological security, must gain more prominence in these relations than before. The EU is indeed a unique experiment of socially conscious capitalism and liberal democracy. It created for itself a zone of peace that is the envy of the world. But to protect that zone of peace will necessitate forging a strategic outlook and practice. Turkey's geostrategic importance has been highlighted by its policies in the Middle East before, and most recently by the turmoil in the Caucasus. It is highly likely that the Black Sea and the Mediterranean will now form a single security space. Under these circumstances, to treat Turkey as a useful ally, but not as a member of the club, as those who favor an alternative type of relation desire, is short-sighted and detrimental to European as well as Turkish security interests. Now, you know, the Italians have an expression, mamali Turki. That is, if you wanted to scare your child, there are two expressions that I know in Italian related to Turks. One is smoking like the Turks. I don't know where that came from. And the other one, of course, is, well, God, the Turks are coming. What are we going to do? So I wish to touch upon some history upon which prejudices have been built, as well as inevitabilities, and then move on to the really critical topic of whether Turkey can salvage its democracy by itself at a time when liberal democracy is under assault everywhere. And for many populist cum authoritarian countries, the last decade and a half of AKP really set a pioneering record of subversive steps to undermine democratic practices. You know, since the foundation of the Republic, Turkey has been a model. Under Atatürk, it was a model because in a Muslim country, secularism was official state ideology. Then in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and you had all those Turkic republics, Turkey's modelness re-emerged so that they would not actually cause headaches to the Westerners. And after 2001, when the jihadis attacked America, Turkish model again was resurrected because, you know, on the one hand you had Al-Qaeda, on the other hand you had this Turkey, which was democratic and soon to be run by an Islamist party, which was supposed to be committed to democracy. Then the third resurrection came in 2011 when the Arab Spring sprang up. And as usual, the concern for the Westerners was, my God, if the Islamists come to power in Arab countries, are they going to bother us? And that's, so why can't they be, or can they be like the Turks? So we were a model. But the real modelship for Turkey was really setting the path, building the path for everyone to emulate. If you wanted to turn your country from actually a fairly well-functioning democracy to a populist cum authoritarian model. Okay. And here's, you know, some of the things that remain, I suppose, in the collective memory of peoples. A British historian once wrote, when in 1544, Francois I of France allowed the Turkish fleet to winter at Toulon, he was not merely giving assistance to the enemies of Christ, and more to the point of Emperor Charles V. He was dissolving a centuries-old antagonism. He was allowing Asia into Europe. By the way, others have seen at that time, the Ottoman Empire is actually the true inheritor of the mantle of the Roman Empire. In fact, Mehmed the Conqueror is reputed, and I don't think it was proven that he said that when he went near Troy, he said that he was avenging the Trojans. Anyway, in 1791, the British Prime Minister William Pitt, during the Ottoman-Russian War of 1791, proposed sending British troops to help the Sultan against the Tsar. He was reprimanded by none other than Edmund Burke, who told him, "What have these worse than savages to do with the powers of Europe, but to spread war, devastation, and pestilence among them?" Voltaire actually liked the comparison. "The morals of the Turks offer another great contrast," he wrote. "They are both ferocious and charitable. Their sloth does not incline them to intemperance or gambling. Very few of them actually make use of the right of marrying several wives and of enjoying numerous slaves. There is no other big city in Europe where there are fewer public women than Constantinople." I don't know. He had also some grudging admiration for Ottoman tolerance. He says they hate Christians, but they let them live among them, which, okay. The well-known and respected historian of the Balkans, Maria Todorova, in her book on the Ottoman heritage in the Balkans, states quite clearly that it is preposterous to talk about an Ottoman heritage in the Balkans. The Balkans are the Ottoman heritage. She points out that the very word Balkan is Turkish, meaning wooded mountain. She also points out that the Balkan Peninsula only came to be considered a distinct geographical unit during Ottoman rule. The issue which became the focus of most of the 19th century criticism of the Ottoman Empire was the issue of equality. It's interesting, you know, when the Tanzimat Edict was declared in 1839, the announcement was made, you know, in Turkish, infidel in Turkish is gavur. So the guy who was supposed to go and announce the edict said, "Yo, the population, you will no longer call the gavur gavur." So that was, if you will, the intent of the depth of the change, and considering the Christian or non-Muslim subjects of the empire as equal citizens. But although there is no doubt that the elevating of Christians to equal status with Muslims raised many problems and cultivated at the beginning of the 20th century with humanitarian catastrophes, it was a measure that was extremely popular with Muslim population at large. We have to see these developments in historical context. In Britain, Catholics got the vote in 1829. In Russia, serfdom was only abolished after 1861, whereas the conditions did not change. 4 years after the Reform Edict was passed, the American Civil War broke out over the issue of slavery. In 1895, France was shaken to its very foundations by the Dreyfus Affair. About a third of what we now call Europe was under Ottoman rule at some point. This was an anomalous situation, yet it was not seen as an anomaly at the time. Throughout the 16th century, the Grand Signior was as much part of the European political scene as Charles V. Both vied for the title of Imperator Mundi. Both had ceremonial crowns made by the same Venetian goldsmiths, and both considered Elizabeth I of England to be a minor nuisance. The anomaly did not come to be perceived as an anomaly until the 19th century, as the European powers established their unquestioned dominion over much of the globe. In one and only one instance was the power relationship reversed. Only the Turk ruled millions of Christians as a Muslim world power, the only one to survive into the 19th century. Here lay the problem. The master who should really be a servant, the ruler who should really be a subject. It simply was not supposed to happen. A Turkish historian, Selim Deringil, argues that this unstated anomaly lies at the heart of much of the anti-Turkish prejudice in Europe today. Yet, he continues, Turkey's own love-hate relationship with Europe continues. The whole of this country's relationship with Europe is evaluated in terms of winning and losing. As we scream in the football matches when a Turkish team wins, Europe, Europe, hear our voice. To win is to achieve recognition. To lose is to fail to do so. In this attitude, we can discern two strands. One, a feeling of being spurned, rejected, a feeling that reflects hurt pride. Two, a feeling of wanting to belong, which is made all the more acute by this very same rejection. One can draw endless analogies between the Turkish predicament and that of the current member states. A favorite of mine is the Spanish case, whereby the Spaniards had to overcome French obstructionism and Blaise Pascal's dictum that Africa started actually at the Pyrenees. So similar to many utterings, those who believe Turkey does not belong in Europe and in fact could spoil Europe's identity. I even heard a Frenchman say that even the trees in Turkey were different than the ones in Europe. I don't know. Yet the legacy of history, the role played by the otherness of the Turk for the construction of European identity, and most recently, the multifaceted Islamophobia prevalent among European publics still set the country apart. For Turkey as well, the relations with the European Union have many complications. As Turkey's sought-after civilizational goal, being a member of the EU, has immense appeal and mobilizational power still. On the other hand, Europe is the historical enemy against which the founding war of the Republic was fought. In a fiercely sovereignty-conscious country, it isn't easy to accommodate such a self-consciously held principle and the obvious need to share sovereignty while implementing the Union's acquis communautaire. Despite the continuous ebbs and flows in this relation, though, time has demonstrated one simple truth. Neither side can do without the other. In fact, a Don at Cambridge once said in the 19th century, quote, "Unfortunately for the peace of mankind, it has happened that the Turk is placed in a position where it is impossible to ignore him and almost impossible to endure him." I really like that. I already suggested that if the Turkish democracy is going to be salvaged, it will be through the efforts of the Turkish public. I don't think anybody else can do it for us. In that context, the municipal elections of 2019, when the opposition candidates have won major victories against really, really severe odds, and the successes they displayed in managing metropolitan centers in spite of unprecedented and vile obstructionism on the part of the government, for me, is a deep source of hope. Today's EU, unlike in previous times, is not a major factor in that quest. In fact, it was probably wrong and naive, and I accept my own guilt or naivete about this issue, to have expected that an outside force can actually consolidate democracy in any given country. Particularly after 2008, when the massive shift in the world system was made more visible, the claims of the West to superior capacity to manage the world economy exposed as vacuous, the EU was in a deep crisis of solidarity that was the appendage to its financial economic crisis. And when the regional environment, because of the Arab revolts, appeared very favorable to Turkey to pursue the adolescent dreams and ambitions of the Islamists, the spell was broken. So today, Turkey is a neighbor, not a candidate country for the EU. This is a time when the future of transatlantic relations, the shape it is likely to take in the next decade, is unknown. Under such circumstances, the relationship will have to be reforged, not a candidate for membership perhaps, but certainly more than a neighbor. To get there, two conditions will have to obtain. Turkey and the EU, one, Turkey and the EU will have to be able to speak with one another rather than at one another. This will necessitate a rebuilding of trust and a mutual desire to forge a common language that is mutually comprehensible. These will be absolutely critical to define common interests, be it in economic or security terms. The refugee issue will have to be tackled as a structural problem, be treated as such, and not a pay-as-you-go irritant. The second condition will be the rehabilitation of Turkish democracy, or at the very least, the rehabilitation of the rule of law and the end to the humiliating deterioration of judicial independence and the assault on the very concept of justice. So how do we get out? This is my last point. I have three scenarios. Two of them, one of them pretty clean, the second one semi-clean, the third one actually nightmarish. The clean one is, by the end of the, I really don't think we can wait until 2023, July, to hold our elections. I suspect by the end of the coming year, we will have elections. And if we do have elections, I don't see any condition under which the current, what do you call them? Not protagonists. Anyway, the current rulers will have much of a chance to be re-elected. And then they will have to go. And that'll be the end of the story. That will be the cleanest. The second is, as I suspect, there are probably in the background, in the Turkish state apparatus, plenty of negotiations that go on because the weakening of the Turkish state, the disembodiment of the Turkish state, and its weakness in the world system have become far too apparent and certainly not sustainable. I mean, our president is going to see his good friend and counterpart in Russia tomorrow. And God, I really wish I'd be a fly on the wall. I don't know what kind of treatment he's going to get. And if that is so, can we expect again a semi-clean passage whereby some wise people can convince the current rulers to basically phase out, and then we can start anew? The third one would be our system's inability to actually overcome our current problems by the dynamics of our system, and a clash over refugees, over minorities or whatever may ensue, and that would be the catastrophic or the nightmarish scenario, because that means it will be bloody. But if that is the option we end up having, the silver lining to it would be that we will have to construct the country anew. And I honestly, sincerely believe that Turkey does have the capacity to do so, because it does have fairly qualified people who can undertake such an endeavor.
Thank you very much, Soli. Wow, lots to ponder. Thank you very much for the historical depth and reminding us of the variety of views that Europe and Europeans have had about Turkey, and of course, reminding us of the magnitude of Turkey in population and economic and all other ways. And of course, needless to say, the fact that it is a part of Europe. Growing up, I remember always there was something called the Balkans sports games.
Of course, yes.
And Turkey was a member of those games with the Albanias, Yugoslavias, and whoever else.
And in fact, whenever the Turks have built something big, it would be the biggest thing in the Balkans and the Middle East.
Yes.
It was never just the Middle East. It was in the Balkans and the Middle East, yes.
Yeah, markers. So, Valbona, you have the privilege
thank
of
you. And
the
actually
first comment and question.
Actually, that brings me to my first question, as you'll imagine, about the influence of Turkey in the Balkans. We have seen an increased influence. Some scholars talk about, in the Balkans, we talk about grafting and grifting foreign, players in the Balkans, and Turkey is part of the first one. So how do you see that developing in the future? So we talked about Russia, China, but Turkey is a very important actor. It's always pushing for the Euro-Atlantic integration of the region, but then there are some other concerns that it might promote different models of governance. And we have seen that, unfortunately, in some countries. So
I went to your
see
country,
that?
I know the complaints.
And the second point is regarding Turkey-China's relations. So we have seen in the last 3 years massive investment from China. I think it was like 30 billion or something, just in the last years. Actually, it's 3 trillion for 2016 and 2019. Just looking at the data. So how do you see that relationship?
3 trillion what?
Dollars.
3 trillion?
Just
Turkey's GDP is 800 billion.
Billion, then it's my fault. So it's $3 billion in 2000, just in the last 3 years.
Okay.
And so how do you see that developing in the
Okay.
future? So both have interests.
Okay, thank you. The Turkish Republic, from its inception, has considered the presence of Turkish minorities in the Balkans an important asset. not for irredentist purposes, but since the Balkans were the gateway to Europe, it would be good to have populations that would be, at least in theory, friendly to Turkey. I remember from my childhood, and at the time, of course, I didn't know much about Yugoslavia, but there were all these Yugoslavs who were coming to spend their summers because they had relatives in our neighborhoods. So in that sense, being part of the Balkans, of course, I didn't know about the Cold War and stuff, and I used to root for the Romanian basketball team because it was yellow and blue, and that was my favorite sports team, and it seems colors. But with these guys, it is also a very ideological thing. That is, it wasn't just a humanitarian cum geopolitical position that the Republic took for the Balkans, but for the Islamists, this was also an ideological thing. And what you were so kind not to mention by name, Islamization has become one of their goals. And in fact, the Sarajevo that I went to in 1997 was very different from the Sarajevo I went to, I think, at the latest in 2010 or 11. Not to mention the Saudi money that came as well. And the Turkish business community has been very active. They were practically the only ones who were actually investing in the region. I've witnessed in both Kosovo and Albania a lot of resentment for the kind of shady deals that were made, and Turkish construction companies in particular have gotten lots of lucrative deals. But that probably this will not be continued, and if it does continue, it will be more akin to the way it was done before than to the way the Islamists have actually chosen to do it. And you can understand why Turkey does push those countries to be admitted to the Euro-Atlantic security pacts, because that would mean continuity that secures Turkey's position, and it also gives it a much bigger space to work on those things. The Islamization thing, I don't think would be as good for the rest of the Atlantic community. As for Turkey, China, look, we have, I think, about $28 billion worth of trade with China. 90% of it is Turkey's imports. The situation you described for the platform and the Balkan country, this is a very unequal relation. This cannot be sustained. Our guys think that they can actually make themselves part of the Chinese sphere of economy. Because of devaluation, our labor cost is now lower than Bangladesh. That's a shameful, absolutely shameful thing to say. Yeah. And my view is as follows. Turkey's economy is part of the European economy. Turkey does not have natural resources. Turkey does not produce much technology. I really don't see what it can give to a China-centered Asian economy, apart from its customs union with the European Union, which is in dire need of renegotiation and, if you will, to go to the next program. And because relations are so soured up, you really even cannot begin to do that. The Europeans are not trying to do that. They complain about Turkey violating. So the Chinese are present there, but they are not coming with the kind of big money that the Turkish government expected them to come with. $3 billion in an economy. That
was just in the last 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah, but still in an economy of about 800 billion, it really is a drop in the bucket. Still, most of our foreign investment, whether it's portfolio or foreign direct investment, really come from Western countries.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say about the high amounts of loans now that come from?
That's what was it? A dependency through debt thing of the China. I mean, look, anybody who looks at Turkey today sees in the dire circumstances in which these guys have actually put the country in since 2008. They literally burnt $128 billion of reserves last year. In order, because the son-in-law, that giant intellect and man of integrity, wanted to keep the currency stable. They literally burned $128 billion of reserves. Our reserves are now at negative 40 billion. That means you have no cushion any longer. And nobody has explained what the reasoning was, I don't know. But in fact, he was the primary person who thought that the Chinese would come and underwrite the Turkish economy. And obviously the Chinese are not stupid.
Okay, Wojciech is the first. And do introduce yourself.
Yes, Wojciech Przybylski, Europe's Future Fellow here at IWM and Visegrad Insight, Poland. I have a question about your view on Turkey's role in security and defense, especially in the light of recent developments. There is Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey's clear involvement in this in supportive role for Azerbaijan. There is an offer to Ukraine. There was also some deal with Poland.
Drones, yes.
At the same time, there is acceptance of another set of rocket systems from Russia, for which, I mean, it puts the relationship of Turkey with the US, especially on the edge in this dimension. And I'm asking this question simply because when we're thinking about, completing a European project, having Turkey as a potential perspective in the future, how does it come together with the discussions about strategic autonomy, Europe's defense overall? How do you think you match these two?
Thank you. The inconsistencies of what passes as Turkish foreign policy these days are absolutely mind-boggling. We're also trying to figure it out. And one of the unfortunate things about this age is people who are not either on the payroll or on the, I don't know, acceptable list of the ruling circles no longer have access. We don't go to panels with them. We cannot talk to them. The foreign ministry, which is still, it's irrelevant, but it is, it's still manned by people. Its personnel still are talkable. Nobody really understands what the logic of it is. So the point was, okay, we can play the Russians. Turkey was right in feeling that its partners, its allies, were not forthcoming in terms of its security needs in Syria. I mean, if you think that the French were blown off water because Obama didn't bomb Syria, so were the Turks. I mean, in Ankara, they were expecting, they were waiting, they were holding their breath, and suddenly, like the French, they were shocked by what did not happen. Then came the downing of the Russian plane, which I don't know who thought of it, but the point of it, I suppose, was we will do this, the Russians will respond, and we can get NATO on our side, and therefore we can actually promote our policies in Syria, and the Americans will do our bidding. It also did not materialize. And then came the coup. And I think both the Americans and the members of the European Union have acted rather shamefully that night. Whatever the true story about that night was, at the moment when it was happening, since we didn't know anything, it should not have been that difficult to call the president or the prime minister, or the next day to drop by Ankara and show your solidarity with the people. Now, having said that, so the government thought that they could play Russia against the United States, that this was a game that they could play ad infinitum. Right now, they have reached the limits of it. But the commitment to NATO continues because even they understand that outside of NATO, Turkey really cannot do much. Moreover, Turkey's actions within NATO have actually
proliferated. They're far more active when it comes to the northern front of NATO. They are on the side of the Ukraine, and you know, they even refuse to accept the legitimacy of the elections, the Russian elections in Crimea, and they have a very weak hand vis-a-vis Russia as well. So what it is they want to accomplish, your guess is as good as mine. But that was a point that many of my colleagues and I have made. Turkey will not leave NATO. NATO does have a trust problem, but now there is a trust problem between France and the United States. So it's not, Turkey could not be singled out. And I always found Turkey is an ally, but is it still a partner? Or Turkey is a partner, but is it still an ally? A rather nonsensical and childish rhetoric if you look at what Turkey does within NATO, if you look at the military contributions and stuff. You haven't really completed your thought. I thought, you know, Turkey does intervene in Azerbaijan-Armenia dispute and stuff. It did bring to an end the gridlocked situation. It should have immediately, in my judgment, opened the borders with Armenia, because at the end of, because the borders were closed because Armenia, ostensibly because Armenia was occupying Azerbaijan proper. Once those were taken back by the Azeris, Turkey could have said, okay, we're opening the borders with Armenia, and that would have, in my judgment, completed Turkey's insertion into the Caucasus, and basically the Russians would have been taking a step back, although they were also situated now in Armenia, but that didn't really help them make the current president of Armenia lose the elections either. So, did I answer all your questions? I don't know. Oh, as to this day, every person whom you would whose opinion you would respect in strategic matters has said, we don't know why we bought the S-400s. And we are now feeling squeezed and we can't use them. And the talk is, of course, and in the recent interview he gave to CBS, the president said that we were going to buy a second package of S-400s. They're incompatible, they cannot be used, and Turkey has paid a very heavy price for it, by the way, as you know. We are kicked out of the F-35 program with an bill of about $12 to $15 billion in lost orders, because Turkey was part of the production. And we would also be doing the repairs or upkeep of certain parts of the aircraft in Eskişehir. On top of that, we cannot buy the aircraft that we paid for either. So we already paid an immense price for it, and there is really nothing to show, and we cannot really deploy them. I really doubt it. Well, look, that was supposed to be part of strategic autonomy, but strategic autonomy necessitates consistency. It also necessitates an economy that functions and a society that is actually has its act together. We don't have those conditions at all. And moreover, when Turkey could say it was being strategically autonomous, or when that quest was reasonable, we had a very different environment. After Trump, with the United States shifting gears, Europe responding to that and all that, we have a very different environment. Of course, Turkey can enjoy having a wide degree of autonomy in the pursuit of its foreign policy. But the thing is, you've got to be consistent in what you do. You can no longer, as I said, play the Russians against the Americans and think that in the space between them, you can do whatever you want. You can't. Look at it. In Syria, the Russians put pressure on you. In Libya, you won a military victory, but you really couldn't translate it into a diplomatic one. And you were cross with the Egyptians for 8 years, and now you're almost begging them to make up. Your relations with Israel are bad. You understand that the relations with Israel ought to be restored, but you really cannot go too far. And you're getting closer with the UAE, whom you accused of organizing or financing the coup against you. This is not a consistent or understandable picture.
Juana Popescu, Zamfir, Europe's Futures Fellow. 2 questions, Soli, if I may. The first one is, to what extent do you think leaving power or preserving it is a pretty existential question for Erdogan at this point and his close circle, to the extent that we are to expect that a peaceful, reasonable transition is not going to happen, because he knows he's going down, and going down literally means losing a lot of the privileges that he and his family enjoy. So this is the first question. And the second one, once gone, inshallah, at some point, what are the chances that, or what's the likelihood, should I say, that the kind of Turkey that we're going to see is not one that's going to follow the Kemalist model, but one that mixes elements of Islam, so a kind of more moderate Islam than what we see perhaps now, but a significant degree nevertheless, mixed with elements of Kemalism?
To the best of my knowledge, never in the history of the Turkish Republic has there been such a degree of, such an increase in the number of per people who have renounced their religion. One good thing that the Islamists have done, or these guys in power have done, I think they finished Islamism off within the country as a political program. The population will remain conservative and deeply religious, undoubtedly, but the new crop of middle class youth whose parents may have been religiously very conservative are modern people. They are the products of 20 years of urbanization, secularization of life, okay? And they have been witness to a degree of corruption that we have not seen before in our history, okay? So life does transform things, and I really do not expect Islamism, maybe some of the cadres of the Islamist movement, but I don't expect Islamism to be a prevalent force in the politics of the country. Having said that, Kemalism has gotten a rejuvenation, if you will, and if there is a resurgence of Kemalism, it will not be the kind of military-style Kemalism that has actually generated some of the problems that we have in the country today. I mean, it is inexplicable and certainly unforgivable that the military, which has staged a coup in 1980 in the name of Atatürk, is the one that gave us this the ideology of Turkish Islamic synthesis. I mean, okay. So if we can actually come back to a more normal politics, I expect that on those 2 scores, I would feel comfortable. What I would not feel comfortable about would be if this is part of a deal within the state apparatus, then society's aspirations may not be answered to the full extent that I would hope. Relations with the European Union will not necessarily become more rosy, but I think they will become more rational. And then we can move from there. I cannot take 5 steps in a row. As to your first question, if we hold elections, they'll go. If we hold elections, they'll go. Otherwise, we'll end up in the 3rd scenario. But if we hold elections, the 3rd scenario would probably be less probable than otherwise would be the case.
A very basic one. Thank you, Soli.
Our former allies, François the Premier.
How is the Green Deal perceived in Turkey, especially now that we know that the carbon border adjustment mechanism may impact Turkish economy?
Yeah.
And how does it play in the ambivalence towards
okay.
the European Union?
Okay, because he is so much in need of money, Erdogan announced when he went to the UNGA meetings that Turkey would finally ratify the Paris conference. But they're doing it only for their heart is not in there. For some psychological reasons, it must be these guys cannot stand the color, the green color of trees. The green of dollar and the green of Islam, they're fine, but the green of the trees, it just drives them wild. It's been 15 months now that the Green Party in Turkey that was founded cannot get its permit to actually organize as a political party from the Interior Ministry. So this is our commitment, or this is their commitment to the environment. But this, I think the consciousness about this is growing because it is now impacting peasants and the comfortable middle classes as well, that you cannot escape it. And if there is a program to which Turkey can subscribe, I think there would be a potential public support for it, and we may go forward. But this issue has not really been tackled with the seriousness and the devotion that it needs, not yet. But I think we're accelerating in along that score.
Thank you, Soli. Thank you very much. That was really a dense presentation, a lot to think about in terms of relations of a European country called Turkey with Europe and the European Union. Thank you all for being here with us. Thank you all of those who are with us virtually. And for those of you who are here, the lucky ones, we will have a wine and cheese downstairs in our refectory. So thank you once again, and tune in to following events of the IWM.